each other since she was just a fledgling reporter at the Poynter Institute back in the day. And it's just such a delight to watch your glow up and read this book, which is very tender-hearted, open-hearted. It braids memoir and deeply reported science. And I just got a lot out of it. And I know you better after spending time in the pages of Slips. So for those who haven't read it yet, do you want to talk a little bit just to set the table about Slip and why it exists?
Yes. So Slip is a book that really does braid personal narrative alongside journalism and research. And for a long time, I thought I had to be fully recovered from my eating disorder to write this book, but decided that that day had not arrived. And so I really wanted to explore what I call the middle place. And so the middle place is where I have lived out most of my adult life. And it is this name I've given to this liminal space between acute sickness and full recovery from an eating disorder. Although I think it's also an apt term for lots of other disorders and other sort of parts of our lives that we may navigate. So the story really looks at how I developed an eating disorder after my mother passed away, looks at my diagnosis, my treatment, relapse and ongoing recovery. And then I did a lot of reporting and wove that in so that I could really make this not just a book about my own story, but make it a lot more expansive so that it would be more inclusive of the diversity of people who really struggle with eating disorders.
Crucially, so much of your own story started when you were quite young. Your mother passed when you were, in third or fourth grade?
Mm-hmm.
So how did you mine your own memory and your own journals? Because I have very few memories of when I was in third or fourth grade, and yet this was so detailed and so rich. So how did you even go back there for the reporting part of it?
Yes. So I was lucky to have a lot of rich source materials. My father, to his credit, had saved all of my old journals, which I started keeping when I was 8 years old and kept them all throughout college. And so I had all of those. And in many ways, they felt like a gift to my present day self because they were so detailed to the point where even then, I think I knew I would one day want to write a book. And so I was able to really use those journals to corroborate memory and to just really re-inhabit my younger self. At times they felt like an emotional Mount Everest that I was climbing up as I read through them because many of them I kept during the most painful parts of my life. But they were very helpful along with medical records, which I was able to obtain. So those were incredibly detailed as well. And I was able to interview the clinicians who kept those records and who treated me. And I did a lot of revisitation too. So I went back to my childhood home where my mother had passed away and where I'd grown up. I revisited the treatment centers that I had been at. And so those revisitations were really important so that I could literally retrace my footsteps in some cases and just be able to put myself back in these places from my past. I'll just say too that there were some places that I couldn't access, like the psychiatric ward where I'd been treated for my eating disorder. I had been on a psychiatric ward because I also had comorbidities like anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder. And I tried to access it, but it's always been very hidden. And so I couldn't. And also for privacy reasons, I wouldn't have been able to actually get on the ward. But I thought about this idea that sometimes there are places that can inhabit our past, but don't have to invade our present. So it was always this sort of push-pull of re-inhabiting the past, but making sure I didn't get stuck in it.
Yeah. What was it like for you just emotionally going back there, going back to some of these places, having conversations with folks who knew you when you were in a very different place in your life?
It was painful at times just to kind of listen to what they had to say. There was one nurse who had said that Mallary simply stopped growing physically and emotionally once her mother died. And that was just so striking to hear that because in many ways I did really stop growing and stopped letting myself feel emotions. There were treatment providers like my doctor from Boston Children's Hospital who said, I knew that you were going to make it. And it was interesting that she said, even though you were so sick and so entrenched in your eating disorder, she said, there was something about you that just made me have hope. And so just recounting all of these kind of memories and talking with these clinicians was helpful for me to better understand how they perceived young Mallary as an adult, right? And how they were able to see my progression in my own adult life.
it seemed to me, and I know different readers will probably have different interpretations, but it seemed to me there were two sort of central questions that animate this book. One was which factors lead people to wind up with eating disorders in the first place? Like, is it nature or is it nurture? How much is nature? How much is nurture? And then the other was, why do some people fully recover and others still struggle in this middle place? Where does the research land on these questions?
Yeah, they're big questions, and they're important ones that I explore in the book. And it's very much nature and nurture. And so it's interesting because I was talking with some geneticists who talk about the fact that certainly there is genetic risk with eating disorders. Children, girls, for instance, who have a relative with anorexia are 11 times more likely to develop the disorder. However, there is not an eating disorder gene. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of genes that actually influence whether or not someone will develop an eating disorder. And so certainly there's genetic risk, but we don't inherit eating disorders. We inherit a vulnerability to them. And so while we have these genetic risks, there are also genetic protective factors, which we don't know as much about, but sometimes those may act as a buffer of sorts. And then we have environmental risk factors and environmental protective factors. So there's these sort of four factors that really play into whether or not someone will develop an eating disorder. At times, it can be something traumatic, like the loss of a parent, that will cause the onset of an eating disorder. Very often, it's not necessarily one thing. It's often a sort of multitude of different factors that can contribute. But other times it can be something innocuous, like a child, for instance, choking on food and then feeling very afraid about eating again. And then they begin to restrict, not as a form of changing the way their body looks, but just because of that fear of food. And then their body gets in an energy deficit where they're expending more calories than they're taking in. And that then leads to a disorder. Now, when it comes to full recovery, I include perspectives in the book from people who are fully recovered because full recovery is possible. However, oftentimes those are the only narratives that we hear. And there are many people who sometimes have chronic cases of eating disorders, or individuals like myself who are better, but are still always having to work on recovery. And for those of us in this place, the disorder remains a vulnerability. And so what's interesting in looking at the research on full recovery is that there are almost as many definitions of full recovery as there are studies on it. It's defined quite differently, which makes it really hard to compare data across studies. And it also makes it so that the ranges of people who fully recover, according to this research, vary so widely as to be comical. And so it makes it really difficult to know how many people actually fully recover and what does full recovery actually mean. I think in a research sense, it's important to have a consensus definition, but individually, it's helpful for us to also think about how do we define recovery for ourselves. But we do know that the earlier someone receives treatment, the better the prognosis. So for individuals, particularly young ones who can receive treatment quickly, that could lead to a better prognosis and a fuller recovery.
Speaking of treatment, the way that they treated you in the, I guess, 90s, mid to late 90s is so different than the treatments that are offered now. Do you want to talk a little bit about how the understanding or clinician understanding of how to treat various eating disorders has changed? And so has the understanding of what is considered an eating disorder. I think like growing up when we were kind of watching Lifetime movies and things like that, it was like anorexia or bulimia. But now there's a lot of different categories. You could talk a little bit about that and then treatment too.
Yeah, sure. So we do know so much more about eating disorders now than we did in the late 90s when I was getting treated. And just for context sake, I was hospitalized 5 times at Boston Children's Hospital. So twice on the medical unit, 3 times on the psychiatric ward, and was really caught in this revolving door of treatment in my early teenage years, and would be hospitalized and then go home and relapse and have to go back again. And so I ended up going to residential treatment for a year and a half. So I lived there, and that's almost unheard of now to be in treatment for that long. I write in the book about how the Department of Mental Health in Massachusetts Massachusetts, and my public school system paid for my actual
Incredible.
treatment.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's no way my family would have been able to afford it. But back in the day, it was more commonplace for children in particular to be extricated from the home and to be sent away to treatment centers. And I remember almost feeling like I was living this institutionalized life.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it perpetuated this idea of being a patient and being sick, and really made me think about this illness identity that I really wrapped myself in. And certainly, sometimes people are going to need higher levels of care. Often they do. And so this is not to say that treatment in-house or inpatient is not important, but there is a lot more emphasis now on family-based treatment, which is not something that was around when I was getting treated. But the idea is that parents and families are empowered to try to take care of the individual at home so that they can actually stay at home and not have to be institutionalized. So there's different treatment modalities now that we have. And I think part of that family-based treatment too is a recognition of the fact that for many, many years, parents were blamed for children's eating disorders, especially mothers. And so oftentimes mothers were told that they were the cause of a child's eating disorder. There was even a term called parentectomy, which is a horrible term, but I know it sounds so bad, but it basically described this idea of removing the child from the home, right? Thinking that that was the only way the child could get better. So treatment has evolved, so has our understanding of it. We now recognize that there are a lot of different types of eating disorders, and eating disorders don't have a certain look. For so long, disorders like this were thought of as white teenage girl issues. And we know that people of all different races, genders, ages, socioeconomic statuses, body sizes,
yeah.
right, all struggle with eating disorders, which is a big part of why I did so much reporting for the book, because I wanted to include their perspectives. And I'll just say lastly that one of the disorders that I was really intrigued by was atypical anorexia, which is a little bit of a cringeworthy name, just because many people who have atypical anorexia, it's almost sort of more the norm that when you are struggling with anorexia, you don't end up getting clinically underweight. And so anorexia nervosa is when you're clinically underweight. Atypical anorexia describes individuals who essentially have all of the same behaviors, they meet all the diagnostic criteria, but they're not clinically underweight. And as such, a lot of times those patients don't necessarily get the treatment that they need because they're overlooked by the medical system. And the medical system is very much lacking in training around eating disorders.
In some cases, I remember there was one example where there was a woman who had been suffering from atypical anorexia basically her whole life and then was told to lose weight.
Yes, exactly. Yes, she was getting Weight Watchers vouchers from the doctor whenever she would try to go. And she had always lived in a larger body, but she was severely restricting her food intake to the point where she was fainting, and went to the doctor, who told her, well, I don't see anything wrong with you. And then she was fearful for years and years of going back to the doctor. And we know many people in larger bodies get stigmatized and shamed, and as such don't want to go to the doctor, which then perpetuates their any health-related issues they may be having.
The other condition that was new to me that I learned about was something that happens with children where they just don't want, is it
ARFID?
ARFID, yeah, yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about ARFID? Because I was like, oh, huh.
Yeah. It's in some ways a sensory kind of aversion to food. And so one of the individuals I interviewed for the book, she talked about how she is very particular about the types of food that she will and will not eat. And sometimes it has to do with texture, but she said, I would rather sort of like pick up dog do than eat certain types of food. And so it's this real sort of sensory aversion that these individuals have. We're seeing it more and more, and children are often the ones struggling with it. However, adults do struggle as well. And so particularly the adults I spoke with said that they find that it's often framed as a child's disorder. And so they feel like they're left out when it comes to treatment and conversations. So it's important that we're recognizing these disorders, but sometimes we're looking at them still through a limited lens in terms of who we think does and doesn't struggle with these disorders.
Yeah. Well, let's bring it back to Mallary and your journey. The book is called Slip because there were relapses at various periods in your life, namely in college at first. And because of the stigma around talking about it, you found it hard to speak up. Do you want to talk a little bit about that as we transition to this part of your story?
Yes. So after I left residential treatment, I really wanted to achieve the gold standard of full recovery. And yet I didn't really know what that meant. All of my providers had said, you want to reach full recovery. That's the ultimate goal. So in my mind, as a perfectionist, I equated it with perfectionism and thought, well, I have to eat just the right amount, exercise just the right amount, get all A's, do all the extracurriculars, which I did. And so I thought, well, if this is what full recovery is, then I must be getting an A plus. And I didn't believe there was a space in between. I thought if I made one wrong move, I slipped just once, then I would slide back into dangerous territory and get hospitalized again. And so that was a really terrifying place to be in some ways. And so I was in this space of kind of what I thought was full recovery for 2 years, and then went off to college and ended up relapsing. We know that college age coincides with the average age of onset for eating disorders, and ended up relapsing freshman year and fell into this very pernicious cycle of binge eating and restricting my food intake. And this cycle lasted well over a decade. But during this time, I continued to tell everyone I was fully recovered because I was ashamed to admit that I wasn't. And I thought, I'm supposed to be over this disorder. What is going on? I didn't realize either that oftentimes eating disorders symptoms shift over time. And so I didn't realize that. And I thought, why am I binge eating? I've never eaten uncontrollably before. And so I felt like I was failing at full recovery and failing at anorexia. And every time I would slip, it was just grounds for failure, and I would sort of have it turn into a slide. An example of that is if I was, eating, for instance, a pint of ice cream, I would think, well, I blew it. I might as well just eat everything in the mini fridge and everything I can get my hands on, and then I'll just restrict the next day. So it's all this slipping and sliding. And then in my late 20s, I ended up working for a nonprofit, and I was helping journalists to tell what we called restorative narratives, which are essentially stories that show how people and communities can make meaningful progress forward in the aftermath of trauma or tragedy or illness. And as I was helping journalists to tell stories about the messy middle, it occurred to me that this could actually be a helpful framework for my own thinking around recovery. And so I began to then identify this language around the middle place. And I thought, what if I normalize slips? And rather than staying silent about them, what if I could recognize that they're a normal part of the process and look at them not as grounds for failure, but opportunities for growth? So I could slip, but then figure out ways to get back up again. And so that's a big part of why I titled it Slip, to really destigmatize the word.
Yeah. We should mention in the earlier part of your narrative, there was a comorbidity, right? You mentioned that not only were you suffering from anorexia, you also were diagnosed with OCD, and you were doing a lot of jumping.
Yes.
And I remember this because later, after you became a mom, there was a rhyme in your book where you said something like, I went from jumping to pumping.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that. And this is a very underreported dynamic of those who are recovering from eating disorders.
Yes, I'm so glad you asked that question because it's not something we talk about much. And so, yes, in the earlier chapters, I talk about jumping, which was my obsessive form of exercise as a child when I was sick. And so I would just jump everywhere, and was very obsessive about exercise and just had a lot of compulsions. And then after I got out of treatment, I thought that the OCD was gone. I mean, I wasn't necessarily experiencing intense symptoms of OCD anymore. But then unexpectedly, after I had my children, I found that I was losing my baby weight. And in many ways, it felt like I was on this losing streak, but it also felt like I was winning because I thought, oh, I'm losing this weight. What if I keep going? And this was, of course, sort of complimented, right, by doctors who would say, oh, well, you're already back down to your pre-pregnancy weight. Like, this is wonderful. And I thought maybe I could just lose a few more. But I didn't want to be in a place where I didn't have enough of a milk supply for my children. So then I began to flirt with this idea of obsessively pumping breast milk because I knew that it would burn calories. I was also fearful of not having enough food for my children. There was sort of this fear around that, and also pressure of knowing that I was the sole provider of their food. But I ended up falling into this compulsive behavior around pumping breast milk to the point where I donated 10 gallons of breast milk when I was sort of pumping for my son, and wrote an article about it for the Dallas Morning News, and thought, oh, this is great. But if you had looked in the margins and in the white space of that article, you would have seen a young mother who was also really silently struggling with a compulsion that doesn't get talked about. So I wrote about that in the book and interviewed 2 researchers who talked about the fact that they were researching this because OCD is quite common postpartum, but we don't talk about it. And they specialize in eating disorders, and said that this is actually very common among women, but because of the breast is best message, often it's silenced. And I will just say that the book's only been out 2 weeks, but I've had numerous women who've reached out to me who have said, I had struggled with pumping obsessively too, but I never heard anyone talk about it. And I thought I was the only one. And I said, oh, yeah, I mean, this is helping people to realize we need to talk about it more, and they're not alone.
Yeah. It's such a service then that you shared your own story. You mentioned at the outset when we defined the middle place that the middle place doesn't just relate to those who are recovering from eating disorders, but all sorts of other life situations. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the middle place, I think, is an apt term for so many of the spaces that we find ourselves in life. So certainly it can be applied to different mental health disorders. It can be applied to substance abuse and addiction. I think the fields of substance abuse actually do a better job of embracing this language of being in recovery, whereas in the eating disorder field, the language is more black and white, which is somewhat ironic given that many people with eating disorders share the same temperament traits, perfectionism being one of them, and rigidity and black and white thinking being another. So when we're sort of using this language, it can actually be detrimental for many individuals with eating disorders. But I think about the middle place too in terms of loss and grief. And I talk a lot about loss and grief in the book, and think about the fact that, I mean, it's been 30 years almost since my mother passed away. And yet I still carry the load of that loss. I've never arrived at a place of closure. I still cry, I still think about my mom, and certain occasions it's still really hard. So I think about myself as being in this middle place with loss and grief. And I had someone recently on the tour say, I'm so sorry you're in the middle place. And it was very well intentioned, but I thought, I don't feel bad about being in this place, and I don't need sympathy in this place. I feel like in this place, I have room to roam, and I can keep moving forward and keep growing. And for me, that's really important because I never want my recovery to be a fixed state.
Yeah. And in fact, if it were, then, you would end up having to uphold that fixed state, which then leads to potential slips. And so one thing as you were talking that occurred to me was that we have yet to talk a little bit about just meeting your husband, your now husband, and being kind of seen through his eyes and feeling loved by him, and how that might have helped you in your recovery, actually. Because I know that the language that we often get is like, you got to love yourself first. But in a lot of ways, he was a real partner to you in recovery. So shout out, especially if he's watching. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm glad that you asked that question because it hasn't come up much. Emily Ramshaw, our mutual friend, mentioned it in the first book tour event that I did. But I think it's important to talk about relationships. And I do have a whole chapter in the book in which I talk about relationships and sex because those are taboo subjects in some regards, especially sex and how that interacts with eating disorders. And I really wanted to cover territory that we don't typically see in eating disorder books. But for a long time, I did think that I needed to divorce my disorder and get over it before I could meet a person who I loved. And I often thought, well, I need to love myself before I can love a partner. And I always was someone who wanted to be in a relationship because loss has always followed me. I've always been fearful of losing someone. And I was afraid that if I wasn't in a committed relationship, then I would lose whoever it was I was dating. So naturally, a lot of guys ran because they did not want to be in a relationship, especially teenage years, early 20s. I wasn't even really dating in my teenage years. But then I ended up meeting my now husband on Match.com, no less. We joke that we should have like a fancier story about how we met. But We met on Match.com, and on our first date, he opened up to me about how his father had passed away in a motorcycle accident when he was 14, and he was really vulnerable with me. And so then that prompted me to talk with him about losing my mom at age 11. And we were sharing these stories, and I certainly didn't tell him about the eating disorder on that first date, but I realized that I really needed to be honest with him because, one, from a practical standpoint, I was seeing him a lot, and so it was harder to hide my behaviors because I was still in this binge restrict cycle. But two, I thought about this fact that honesty really could be the heartbeat of our love and our relationship. And so I ended up telling him a few months into our relationship and thought that it would make him run away. But in fact, it drew us closer because he was able to see my strength in that. And he said, that's one of the things I love about you. And in being really truthful with him and honest with him, it then gave me in some ways permission to allow myself to then talk with him about my slips. And this was around the time that I was working on restorative narratives, developing the middle place idea. So it was this beautiful confluence of factors that really then helped me to really make meaningful progress in the middle place. And he's still the person who I always try to talk to when I have these slips. And that's such an important part of recovery, is recognizing who that person is in your life, who you can trust, and also figuring out how do you ask for the right kind of support. Because my husband will listen, but he never lectures. And he's learned to listen to my slips and hear me talk about them from a place of curiosity as opposed to a place of judgment. So that's been hugely helpful.
Struggling with body acceptance is something that's so universal to all of us, especially given the society and the very visual culture that we are coming up in and have come up in. Now that you are an expert in this field, what do you feel like are the ingredients to get to a place of body acceptance?
Well, I'm really glad you said body acceptance, because sometimes there's this pressure to love our bodies unconditionally. And that can be really challenging, particularly in our society. We live in a society that is very much steeped in fat phobia and diet culture. There was something in the book that I addressed called normative discontent, which is essentially this term that researchers have coined because they've done research showing that the vast majority of people in our society have some level of discontent with their bodies to the point where it's more the norm than the exception. So that's the society that we're recovering into. And we have to recognize that we can't recover from an eating disorder and believe that we're just going to have beautiful body image days every single day of our lives, because it's just not realistic. I mean, it's great if you do, right? I'm not saying that that can't happen, but for many of us, it's not realistic. And so I really try to think about just neutralizing the way that I look at my body. And I even talk about this with my kids in terms of thinking about how their bodies help them to take up space in the world. Their bodies help them to move and to play. And food is fuel for their bodies so that they can do those things. And I really help them to think about how do they feel more comfortable taking up space and showing up. And I try to think about that for myself too. Sometimes I teach my children the things that I want to get better at learning myself. And so you had a beautiful line when I interviewed you, Elise, and I can't remember who coined it, but you were saying that, you know, the body is not an ornament, it's an instrument.
Yeah.
And I think that that way of looking at it is so important, because it's so often the case where we look at our bodies as something that has to be on display, and we equate our worth with our weight. But if we can think about the functionality of our bodies and think about just appreciating what our bodies do for us, that can be so helpful. I think about all that I put my body through, to the point where I needed to be admitted to the emergency room the first time my father took me to Boston Children's Hospital, because I was so physically sick. And so I think about all that I did to my body, all that I put it through, and how far it's carried me despite that. I've been able to have 2 kids. I can run, I can walk, I can sort of be here tonight and travel here. So I feel very lucky to be able-bodied, but I also feel really great about being in this place in my recovery where I can really appreciate how far my body has carried me.
Yeah, that's lovely. That's lovely. The other aspect of the society that we're recovering into is wellness culture and the overlap of some of the wellness behaviors and goopification of things
I love that word.
with potentially disordered eating habits. So how do we address that and recover into that?
Yes. So I mean, I would say several years ago, the word diet became somewhat of a dirty word to the point where many people, including influencers, were moving away from that word and toward wellness, right? So we hear wellness all the time. And oftentimes it is this code word for diets. And so that, though, makes people feel like, well, I'm just doing something that is supposed to be good for my body, even if it means sort of doing something that's really grueling or potentially dangerous for my body, just because I want to be well, right? But we have to really try to decode those messages, which can be incredibly hard when we're bombarded by these messages on social media and various places. And so part of it is becoming a more critical consumer of media, which can be really hard to do, right? But recognizing that a lot of times, for instance, products will be marketed to us and then we use them and they don't work on us. And for many of us, our immediate reaction may be, well, I'm the problem, right? This has gotten all these great reviews. It's supposed to promote wellness. It's not making me well, though. So I must be the issue. And we're so quick to blame ourselves instead of blaming the product. And so that internalization of this wellness culture can be really toxic in a lot of ways because we often get in situations where we feel like we can never be well enough or we can never meet that societal standard of what we're supposed to look like and how we're supposed to take up space in this world. So there is this pendulum swing that is often going back and forth between sort of body acceptance and body positivity and then the thin ideal. And we've seen this shift more toward the thin ideal more recently, I would say, with skinny talk, social media trends on TikTok and other places, with the rise of GLP-1s. And I don't want to demonize those drugs because they have a place, for folks with diabetes or people who believe that they want to take them. But at the same time, we need to be really careful about prescribing them to people with a history of eating disorders.
Right.
And we also need to recognize that because of those drugs, we are hearing so much more messaging now around weight loss. And it's just adding to that pollution in some ways, right? And adding to this din of diet culture that really follows us throughout our lives.
Which leads me to one of my final questions before I open it up to you all. What about men? Because eating disorders are so often conflated with girls and women, but how are the boys and men doing?
I'm so glad you asked because so often when I talk about my experiences and I say that I'm a mother of a daughter and a son, many people will say, well, are you worried about your daughter, right? And of course, I know it's a well-intentioned question, but I think I'm worried about my daughter and my son. I mean, as a mother, I worry multiple times a day about my kids getting an eating disorder. And I try so hard to really create a protective environment for them, but I can't help but worry about that. And I worry about it equally for my son and my daughter, because men do struggle with eating disorders, as do transgendered individuals. And so oftentimes they're left out of conversations because eating disorders are often framed as a woman's disorder. And so I interviewed many men in the book who said that they felt like they couldn't really talk about their eating disorder because they felt like they would be shamed or stigmatized. Other times, medical providers didn't necessarily think that they were struggling because, again, most medical doctors are getting between 0 and 2 hours of training on eating disorders.
Wow.
And because of that severe lack of training, naturally, these stereotypes about who does and doesn't struggle are going to factor into the care that they're providing or who they are diagnosing and who they're not diagnosing. And so it's important for men to be part of this conversation, which is another reason why I didn't just want to be another white, thin girl writing a book about eating disorders. I really wanted to include men and, a diversity of individuals to show that eating disorders really do not discriminate.
Yeah, I thought you did a very panoramic job with the research. In fact, the research, I think the endnotes take up about 20% of the book when I read it by Kindle, because I was like, it's over it. But I'm only at 81%. And that's because there's so many endnotes. It's so thoroughly researched. So for my last question, what surprised you most in all of your research? Are there little nuggets or is there a nugget that you want to share that really jumped out at you?
Well, there's so
probably
many,
a few,
but,
right?
But yes, I mean, the one that immediately comes to mind is just how prevalent and populous the middle place is. I thought that I was the only person in this place, and that is genuinely the case, where I thought I'm the only one in this place because nobody's talking about it, right? And I'm in this weird like limbo period or place where I'm caught in between these extremes of acute sickness and full recovery. But in my reporting, I found that it was this beautiful process of discovery where I recognized that I was not the only person in this place. And I ended up surveying over 700 people from 44 states and 37 countries with lived experience with an eating disorder. And of those 700 plus people, 85% of them said that they could identify with the middle place. And I thought, oh my gosh, this place is populous, and yet it is so overlooked. And I talked with a lot of people who said that they remained silent in the presence of a place that seemed ineffable. And they felt like they didn't really have the words or vocabulary to be able to talk about this place that they were in. And so it was really freeing in a lot of ways to talk with individuals and to hear them say, I'm in this place. And I like that there's a name for it, right? And I think whenever we can name something, there's power in that. And so that for me was just one of the most eye-opening parts of this book. And one of my ultimate goals as a writer is to really help people feel seen and heard, and to make people feel like they are in an inclusive place. And I think when we talk about the middle place and when we expand our verbiage for talking about recovery, then we can really be more inclusive in our approaches to treating eating disorders.
Yeah, and this book goes a long way to giving people voice and license. So thank you for all your hard work on it. Thank you, Mallary. And with our remaining few minutes, do y'all have questions? I always think the audience questions are much better than mine. So
No, yours were wonderful, but I'm sure
you're in for a
audiences
treat.
will be too.
And you can just kind of yell them out.
I have a question. Were there any anecdotes or things that you really wanted to include in the book, but just the editor said, for whatever reason, it doesn't belong, or things that, or like maybe give it, if you're open to giving an example? Yeah.
Yes, there were so many because I interviewed 175 individuals, but there was no way that I could have included all of them in the book. And so that was really hard for me to figure out who to include, who not to include. There were people who I'd included in earlier chapters, like sample chapters that I submitted in my book proposal when I was trying to find a publisher, but ended up having to take them out as the book changed over time. But there was one individual whose story I was really drawn to, and she was a mother who had struggled with anorexia and bulimia in her teenage years. And then when she became a mother, she was in a place of recovery, not full recovery, but pretty solid in her recovery. And she was a stay-at-home mom. She had 3 boys, 2 or 3 boys. And when her youngest went off to college, she felt like her sense of purpose had suddenly withered. And she ended up kind of falling back into food restriction. This was also coinciding with the pandemic, where we saw a rise in eating disorder cases. And she ended up needing a higher level of care. And so she had to go back into treatment. And she was in her 60s, right? And people midlife often do struggle with eating disorders because many of them never actually got treatment in the 70s, 80s, or 90s when they were struggling. And so either they've continued to be sick, or they've relapsed because maybe their recovery wasn't as solid as they thought it was. So she went back into a treatment center, but was there with teenagers, and she felt like she had to be a mother to them. I've since sort of talked about this narrative in different interviews I've done around anorexia and eating disorders in midlife, but I so wish that I could have included her perspective, because she said she checked herself out early of the treatment center because she just couldn't do it as the sort of sole older person there. So there's so many narratives like that that were so worthy of being told, but for various reasons, I just couldn't include them.
Hey, no, hi, Elise. Was your just a question about the middle place, which it's still floating liminally in my brain. Is it was your idea of sort of noting it of related to your ability to deal with imperfection, or of just I'm a human being, I can do the best I can, but I'm bound to, because I'm human, not be perfect.
Yes, because I've always been a perfectionist. And for a long time, I thought that I had to be perfect at my recovery. But embracing the middle place really helped me to get better at embracing imperfections, which is still something that's hard for me, right? I talk in the book about this new treatment modality. It's called temperament-based treatment. And it really is about treating the trait and recognizing we don't have to change inherently who we are in order to recover. Because there are certain temperament traits that people with eating disorders have, and perfectionism is a big one. But getting better is not about getting rid of perfectionism. It's about recognizing that when we're sick, oftentimes these temperament traits get expressed destructively. And in recovery, we have to learn how to express them productively. And so for me, that really meant embracing the middle place and developing language around it and recognizing that it was okay to be in this space, and that being in this space did not mean settling for stagnancy. It meant always working on my recovery, recognizing that I may never fully recover. Who knows, right? But recognizing it was okay to be in this space. So that has helped me to just embrace the messy middle more and to not be as perfect at my recovery, because I recognize that that approach failed me when I was younger. And it's better for me to be authentic about where I'm at. And as a journalist, I really like stories that don't have tidy endings. And I like messiness. As a writer, I like delving into it. So in some ways, it makes sense that I would be kind of exploring this terrain in my own life.
So is the middle place kind of your non-static, occasionally topsy-turvy home?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, that's a good way of describing it. It is where I live, and the longer I live in the middle place, the more expansive it gets. I'm no longer sort of sandwiched between these two extremes of acute sickness and full recovery. I have room to roam, I have room to grow. And that's a really important part of what I try to convey about the middle place, because often in the field it's referred to as quasi-recovery or pseudo-recovery, which I think are harmful terms in that they can make people feel like their recovery is not real or they're somehow faking it. That's not what this is. This is about recognizing that for many of us, recovery can be an ongoing process that we need to keep working at. And so, yes, this is where I end up, this is where I live my life.
Willie Nelson's tour bus minus the cannabis.
Yeah. I love your
It's a
analogies.
liminal place, yes.
I have a question about the story about the older woman who sort of whittled away after her son went to college, which really struck me. I'm wondering how you feel the role of identity plays a role in assuming an eating disorder, and what their crossover is in terms of this is my thing.
Yeah.
Without this, I feel X, Y, or Z, anxious, unanchored, untethered, depressed. And then have you noticed that the times where you're not slipping, if there's another identity anchor that you feel the need to fasten into?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked about illness identity, because I've been wanting to write a piece about this because I'm fascinated by it. But I was very much sort of entrenched in my eating disorder. And I used that word twice already, because I remember one of my dietitians at Boston Children's Hospital used that word in my medical records, and I was so struck by it. But I very much wanted to be the sickest anorexic. And I almost hate saying that now, but I mean, I wanted to be perfect at anorexia. And that was my whole identity, to the point where I stopped socializing with people. I stopped engaging in pastimes that I'd loved. My whole life revolved around the eating disorder when I was acutely sick. And I no longer recognized myself in a lot of ways. And I've since learned that I did a lot of kind of work on talking with neurobiologists and researchers who are looking at what happens to the brain when one struggles with an eating disorder. And often for adolescents, when they're developing their sense of identity, connections are formed in the brain. And those connections rely on white matter. White matter is partly made up of something called myelin, and the production of myelin in part relies on a person's dietary fat consumption. And so starvation then can severely alter that production, right? And so it leads to altered neurodevelopment and also leads to a distorted sense of self. So there's actually sort of changes happening in the brain, particularly at that age. And it makes sense now as to why I was so wrapped up in this illness identity. And now if I think about my identity, I think about it as a pie where there are a lot of different slices, and anorexia used to take up that whole pie. But now it still does take up a slice, right? There's no denying that. But there are a lot of other slices too, right? I am a mother, a wife, a professor, a friend,
An
a
author.
journalist, an author, right?
Yeah.
There's so many other things. And so as the eating disorder has diminished, it has enabled me to expand my life and identity in so many other ways. And really, this idea of embracing the middle place and giving it a name and talking about it on tour and in the book, I mean, that is an identity that I really come to love, because for so long I was living out this inauthentic narrative of telling everyone I was fully recovered when I wasn't. And now to be able to confidently and courageously say I'm in the middle place is really important to me. And it does sometimes feel like an act of bravery in a society that really prefers protagonists who prevail and triumph over their disorders. So when I have these moments where I'm drawn back into the eating disorder, I try to remember that I am a woman in the middle place, and I've not defeated my disorder, but my disorder hasn't defeated me either. So it's a good place to be.
All right, that's beautiful.
I'm really curious how, after all the time it took you to research the book, write the book, and everything, how you mentally prepared for it coming out, and this now tour that you're on. And was there any part of it that, you were scared, or it was like difficult to, like, you were worried that it might like bring things up? And how has that been for you? Have you slipped during this time?
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a really personal question.
No, it's fine. I mean, yeah, I'm so used to talking about all of this now. I mean, it was interesting. When I was writing the book, I definitely had these moments where I was trying to recreate certain experiences. Like I was writing about binge eating in college, and then I found myself actually binge eating and eating uncontrollably. And I thought, okay, I need to stop this, because as a writer, sometimes there has been this temptation to sort of recreate certain behaviors or re-engage in them so I can access them better and write about them more effectively. And I knew I had to be really careful about that, particularly when writing about the years when I was acutely sick. So I did go back to therapy as I was writing the book, and it's been helpful too, just as I prepared for the launch of the book. I've also just been reminded over the past few weeks of how hard it is to please the overachiever in me, because of course that is just inherently part of who I am. And so the same girl who wanted to be perfect at her anorexia now wants to be sort of like the best published author and on all the bestseller lists and all the things, which is so hard to do. And so I have to kind of recognize that about myself, and also appreciate kind of all of these little small victories I've had along the way, whether it's a media appearance or an email from someone who says the book impacted them. And also, recognizing that I'm going to hear from people maybe who don't like certain parts of the book. I mean, the feedback that I've gotten so far has been really encouraging and positive. But, there's like 3-star reviews on Goodreads. Of course, I know all of their names. And so it's just like those little things. But even today, I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal that was published. It was about my eating disorder. And look in the comment section. And sure enough, there's somebody who commented and said, oh, there's so many bigger problems in the world than an eating disorder. Like, stop with the navel gazing. And I just thought, you know what? Like, you just don't get it, right? And I thought, I'm not going to engage with this individual. I reported it, and I said in my comments, like, to whoever reads those reports, that eating disorders are a life-threatening, or can be life-threatening, mental and physical disorders. So this is disrespectful. It was taken down, right? But when you are an author and you're sharing your story, you are just going to be in a position of vulnerability, and you are going to get potentially criticized or critiqued. And so part of what I did when writing this book was every step of the way, I was anticipating my critics, right? Anticipating, well, who's going to try to poke holes in this? And then I would actually then try to interview those individuals. That was a coping strategy for me. It was also part of my journalistic training to try to get a multitude of viewpoints. But that in some ways felt like this armor where I thought, okay, I'm putting this book out into the world, and I know I've done my due diligence to really recognize sort of where those holes might be, and to sort of address the critics. And I feel like that was an effective strategy that's actually made me feel a lot better about putting the book in the world.
Okay, fantastic.
So, Mallary, one of the things I appreciate so much about your book is you say, sort of regardless of what science says, because science is mixed, whether or not this is an addiction, right? And you do such a good job of showing the obsession and the compulsion. I think you call it a monster, right? The challenge, though, is we have to keep eating. We can't stop alcohol and drugs, right?
Yeah.
And food is also delicious. So how do you still navigate that, right? I mean, it's such a challenge. How do you stop thinking about it?
Yes, it is really challenging because, I mean, you're right that you can't stop the substance. And yes, there's many kind of just thoughts on whether or not eating disorders are an actual addiction. And I talk about that in the book. And oftentimes, sort of research contradicts itself. But I defer to the many people who, in some ways, feel like they're either addicted to starvation or addicted to food. And so I just try to kind of look at those narratives and talk about how people feel in those moments where they feel completely out of control. And you're right. I mean, we need food to survive. And so for those of us who've struggled with an eating disorder, oftentimes these questions run through our minds. And it's this constant racetrack where we're trying to think about, well, when do we eat? How much do we eat? How little do we eat? How often, right? And I still often have those questions. They are not sort of questions that are taking over all of my mental space, but they still are there, right? And they are sometimes just harder to grapple with in certain periods, right? And so I have to recognize that and be really cognizant of it. Even thinking about traveling, right? I mean, from a physical standpoint, like I've not been that hungry on this book tour. And it's the first time I'm talking about this, but I've recognized that about myself, that if I get nervous or if I'm really busy, my natural instinct is to just not eat as much and I don't physically feel as hungry. And so part of my recovery is always trying to figure out how do I try to navigate that. So I've been really deliberate about scheduling dinners with friends around these events just to make sure that I'm actually in community with people and eating meals. And so that's a way that I try to kind of navigate that, if you will. But it's a constant, work in progress.
I mean,
One more?
it's-
Okay.
It's about breaking the routine.
Mhm.
You know, if you're living in a little place, there ought to be like warning signs that say, I'm gonna break my routine, there won't be oatmeal with fruit for the next 4 or 5 days unless I go to a special place, but
Yes.
I have to understand that.
Yes, exactly. Because rigidity is another sort of trait that is very common among people with restrictive eating disorders in particular. And I do recognize my own tendency to be somewhat rigid around my food intake and around eating similar foods day to day. And so I think part of the beauty of traveling is that it helps me to get out of that, right? I mean, I had 2 big pieces of French toast this morning, which I would never eat at home, but I thought, this is good. I'm enjoying this and I'm letting myself enjoy this. And I try to recognize those moments where I break out of that rigidity and loosen up a little bit, if you will, because that loosening up, has always been hard for me.
Well, thank you, Mallary, so much. Thank you all for being here and for being such an engaged audience. And Tessa and Zibby, the bookstore, thank you so much for hosting this event. It's been so lovely to be here.
Yeah, thank you.